Are you handing straight over to Francesca? I see you're doing a double
Oh,
act, you two there. So Francesca, are you around? You're going to tell us directly a little bit words from the council.
yeah, thank you. Can you see that? Okay, I've put a slide up. Fantastic. Okay. Well, it's really lovely to be invited by SECA, who have achieved so much to push climate action forward regionally. So thank you. I'm Francisca Iliffe. I'm the Strategic Sustainability Manager at Ada and Worthing Councils. And we've been developing really ambitious work on this agenda, but we recognise the importance of local leadership to deliver climate action. I'm going to base my talk on the Committee on Climate Change work around the 6th carbon budget, for which they've developed a really great report called Local Authorities and the 6th Carbon Budget. And this makes recommendations to local authorities, but also to government, to enable local authorities to do more towards net zero. And I think this combined approach is really vital. It can't be one or the other, it has to be both. So I hope this helps with your discussions around step change towards net zero. Oh, just trying to move my slide on. There we go. So the 6th carbon budget presents an immense scale of transformation that's needed. It describes a steeper downward curve to carbon reduction than we've ever seen before. And the CCC calculate that local authorities have some influence over so many sectors that local action could deliver nearly half our national emissions reductions. So this chart shows how councils can control or influence emissions through their wide-ranging services and functions. And it starts at the top little blue circle with emissions in direct control of councils, which are for their buildings, operations and travel. But these actually account for less than 5% of the area-wide emissions. And it's slightly more for counties and unitary authorities that control highways and waste disposal, but much less for districts and boroughs like Ada and Worthing. We have less than 1% of our emissions direct from the council. It's less than 1% of the area-wide emissions. Secondly, the dark blue ring is emissions from procurement and commissioning, which we can control. Many decisions council make are on long-term contracts that last for decades, like waste. And these can lock in emissions for the long term. All of these investments need to be completely net zero by 2030, preferably sooner, of course. Thirdly, is through place shaping, using the powers of planning, and for those that are also highways authorities, transport powers. Again, decisions made now have the power to lock in emissions into the future, but planning authorities have very limited powers to require net zero development. And furthermore, nationally set housing targets work against the net zero agenda and show us a really fragmented national approach. Fourth is through showcasing, innovating and piloting and demonstrating good practice that shows scalable, replicable solutions for others to adopt. So for example, Worthing Borough Council is developing plans for a net zero heat network that other large organisations can connect to facilitate heat decarbonisation at scale. Fifthly, councils can influence through partnerships, through leading and bringing together organisations and joining other partnerships. And a great example of this is the work of West Sussex County Council, who are delivering the first national county-wide net zero electric vehicle charging network. And lastly, but crucially, through engagement and communication, to bring local residents and businesses on board with their huge purchasing power and ability to deliver decarbonisation through behaviour change. So Ada and Worthing made a start on this by holding a climate assembly and working with Transition Town Worthing and Worthing Climate Action Network to hold the Zero 2030 Climate Conference, but it's a drop in the ocean. There's so much further to go. So despite all of these areas of either control or influence, there are massive gaps in power and policy that could be addressed only by national government. And what's more, councils have no statutory duty to deliver on the Climate Change Act. And this results in islands of good and bad practice, with every council having to effectively find their own way through all of this, with no coordinated central approach. So because of this lack of coordination, the CCC makes strong recommendations to government on what they need to do in relation to local authorities. And SECA members might want to review these to government when you're considering your step change programme. So firstly, on policy, government are planning a net zero strategy, but the CCC urges government to also develop a net zero delivery framework through which all government departments, all tiers of government, national and local, are aligned and coordinated, and would bring all transport, planning, waste and other functions under the net zero lens. And CCC urge government to really engage with local councils to clarify this framework so that they provide the additional powers needed locally, such as in planning. Secondly, they recommend government consider placing a duty on local authorities to act in accordance with the net zero strategy, which Scotland have done. Thirdly, they ask government to make policies consistent with net zero. So government is bringing forward loads of new strategies and policies, including a net zero review of Treasury, but they all have to work together and be joined up around the net zero agenda. Fourthly, to support area-wide planning for energy, transport and building retrofit, which should include really robust area-wide energy planning and also transport decarbonisation plans, with a duty to collaborate between the different agencies. Then they go into funding and support, and the the CCC call for an increase in the revenue funding and support for local authorities so that they can develop the skills and capacity to plan and implement climate action. Many councils have been developing new climate posts. At Adrian Worthing, we've upped our sustainability capacity from 1 to 5 in the last year, but this is difficult against a backdrop of budget cuts that makes it hard for many councils to follow suit. And there have been fantastic amounts of capital funding released to councils as competitions under the Building Back Better programme for things like active travel and public sector decarbonisation. But loads of councils are missing out on this because they simply don't have the in-house expertise and project pipelines to be able to secure those funds. So CCC would also like to see coherent cross-departmental support on climate action. A great example that we experience of good departmental support is through the Heat Network Delivery Unit in Bays, which provided invaluable support to Worthing, and we just couldn't have progressed the Worthing Heat Network plans without them. The CCC would like funding to be non-competitive, long-term, completely aligned with net zero. Oh, my time is coming up. So sorry. I think I'd better just jump straight onto the recommendations for councils, because that's really important. On councils, they want to see all councils developing a net zero climate action plan against which we've seen good progress. Secondly, to monitor and report on that. Hopefully there'd be a standardised approach to data gathering. Thirdly, to conduct policy and service reviews to align policy spending with net zero. Fourthly, to implement training and capacity building so that staff and members have the skills around this. Fifth, to develop capacity to innovate and scale up so that councils have delivery projects so that they can jump on funding streams when they become available. Sixth, to collaborate with neighbouring cross-tier local authorities on strategies and plans like the West Sussex example so that councils can cluster and share skills. Seventh, to develop green finance know-how. We need to be finance savvy as we'll need private sector investment and green finance to deliver scale. Eighth, and crucially, to communicate and engage with local communities, an issue close to all of our hearts, that councils should support community action with citizens, schools, businesses and other groups. And finally, pension funds. So the CCC want to see disclosure of councils in their approach and more of a move towards net zero aligned pension fund investments. I think that's quite a robust list. It's interesting that offsetting, sustainable food and climate adaptation and ecology they don't really come out in the recommendations, but they are largely there in the detail. So that's a really quick overview of the report. And what it really stresses is that local authority roles are vital to achieving net zero, but it really needs to be backed up by a coherent national approach from government.
Thank you, Francisca.